Good morning, Assembly, and welcome back to the ARTtech Seminar. This Saturday, the first speaker is here from the University of Jyväskylä, and he'll be talking about his experience with creating VR games. Please welcome Mikko Mäntylä.
Hello. So let's get the show started. My name is Mikko Mäntylä. I'm a student at the University of Jyväskylä, and I'm also a hobbyist game developer, and also do a lot of other things. But one of my kind of main areas in game development, what I'm particularly interested in is accessibility and kind of different kind of use cases, and making the game experience different or better in many cases, and I'd like to learn about it more. And that is why I'm also having this presentation, which somewhat incorporates that certain theme. But what I've done is initial firefighting simulator. I made it with Unity using the virtual reality toolkit asset, and it first started in a hackathon last year, but I've been developing it for around 2 weeks now, and I've incorporated some of my things that I've learned with accessibility for it, and also learned many new things with it. And a little bit about getting started with your very first VR game. And when people first are thinking about making the first VR game, what should I create VR games? There are many reasons for and against it, and you will probably hear such thing as VR is the future, though we don't actually know if it's going to be big anytime soon or anything, because as the numbers are right now, VR isn't popular because it is expensive. And because it is expensive, game companies don't put that much money in it, and therefore there are not that much content for people to buy VR equipment. It's a bit of a loop, and because of that, VR isn't that big, even though it is a lot bigger than it first came out. And what I think about VR and about any kind of development, whatever it is, if it's fun, just do it, because you will learn always new things about it. And there's nothing wrong about learning new things. And I'm going to tell you about some things that are wrong with VR. Not exactly wrong, but what can be a real hindrance and what are some real problems that can arise when developing the VR games. Here comes the first thing, which is essentially that VR devices are not the same at all. There are, as many of you probably know, there are two big main contenders are HTC Vive and Oculus Rift, and they have some similarities. For example, the head-mounted device, the HMD, they are quite similar. You can lean, you can move, and with an external, you can have both of them room scale too, if you want, which makes the head device mostly the same. But where the difference comes in is the controllers, and even the shape of the controllers are really different. On Oculus Rift, it's more of like a gun, where the Vive is more of like a what do I call a television remote, for example. That's what it seems to me, at least. And then there's the third and the most popular one, which is Android. Android VR, for example, Gear VR from Samsung, and Google Cardboard on most Android devices. And that isn't at all comparable to the more expensive PC variants, because on mobile you don't have controllers, and the head device even there are not so many positions for you to be. You can't lean. You can just kind of work with the sensors with it, and you can just move your head around, mostly for sitting experiences. But it's still more limited compared to Oculus Rift sitting experience. And one of the things that I started running into when I tried kind of establishing my my image on how are there any standards on the Vive controller. I use primarily Vive because I own it, so it's going to be mostly from Vive perspective, though I've tried all the major contenders for it also. So that the Vive controller is quite simple. It has some really good layouts. Buttons have pictures on it, which makes it more easier to kind of get the idea what the button would be supposed to do. For example, it has a button which has 3 vertical lines in it. Represents kind of like a menu button that you can see in most UIs, but not all games use it like a menu. Some games use it like a menu. When you click it, you open some kind of menu. But I've seen examples where, for example, you drop an item with it, which is not consistent at all. And that's kind of like the problem when you kind of don't have that much of a standard. The Vive has some standards. For example, when you press the plate pad on the top side of it, it is used primarily for teleporting in most games, and that's something that is quite established as a standard. But on top of that, there are pretty much no standards for anything. In some games, you can pick up items with the trigger button. With some games, you can pick up items with grip button, and so forth and so on. And one thing that has primarily been that I've primarily been noticing here when I've been demoing my game here has been that the Vive controller isn't that familiar with people. It isn't really easy to learn. My theory on why it isn't that easy to kind of get a grip on the controller is because you don't kind of inspect it before you put on the headset. When you go, I want to try out the Vive game. People are just going to put the head device on you, give you the controllers, and then you're like, okay, I'm gonna play this. But you're gonna have the controllers like whatever on you have, and you have absolutely no clue what the controllers actually have on them. For example, the controller sides have the grip buttons on them. Absolutely no one knows that they exist if they haven't actually seen them with their own eyes before, and someone telling them that there's a grip button on the side and it probably has some function on it. And that is, to my mind, one of the biggest problems in VR at the moment, because VR is mostly used in an expo environment or a con or festival like Assembly, where there are VR devices to try out, which is how most people actually have the first and possibly even last experiences with VR, because the devices are so expensive. So that when you first get to try out the controllers, you will actually have no clue what to do with them. When you get an Xbox controller, you can just turn it around and look at it while you are playing. But when you are playing in VR, you may see your controller in the game, but you can see your hand on it. And when you can't know actually where the hand is in the controller, it is really hard to actually press something like a grip button. And then the developing aspect. When developing the first VR game, it is usually gone in blind, if not using some tutorials, and there are some really deep pitfalls going on there. For example, you need to set up a project environment for the VR system, and that's going to require a lot of work if you are not using some ready-made libraries. And even when using some ready-made libraries, not all are that's kind of like plug and play. You need to work with them a lot. So you could even end up spending most of your developing time on just setting the environment to kind of feel like what it's supposed to feel, and after tens hours of coding and kind of like configuring, you can get to the actual development part. And of course, developing for VR usually needs the actual VR device. So without simulating the environment, you have to actually spend the 6,000 to 1,000 euros just to get the device, and on top of that, you have to have a powerful PC. But if you were to have a simulated environment, you could do with a lot of less computer power, and you wouldn't need to have the VR at hand. You could, for example, if you have a local IGDA hub or something like that, somewhere where you could like test your creations, you would like develop it home and then bring it there. And that's where I'm coming at. When developing for VR, you should make your life much easier. And by that I mean mostly using libraries. On Unity, I've been using the virtual reality toolkit called VRTK, and it can be found on GitHub and on Unity's asset store. And there are other assets for Unity, for example, NVIDIA samples, NVIDIA VR samples, and so on and so forth. Many different kind of things, both paid and free. And on Unreal Engine, I haven't actually developed anything, but I've heard of it much and seen some. And what I know is that Unreal Engine has built-in support for, if not all, most, then at least most of the VR types. At least Vive and Oculus Rift are fully inbuilt into the system. And if the environment or the libraries you have support simulators, use them, because it will speed up your developing time by a lot. Because I can tell you nothing is more frustrating than when you are in the middle of the developing flow. You have to get the Vive headset on your head. You have to pick up the controllers. You have to go to the area where that you have designed to play with it. Try out the single feature you just tried to bug fix, and it doesn't work. Headset off, controllers off, back to the drawing board. Or at least, or what I do is just lift the head device and pray for it not to fall. But for example, VRTK supports simulators, so that if you are just trying one little feature that may or may not work, it could be actually a lot faster, because you can move with WASD and mouse, and you can do some simple grabbing and item using inside it. It's not pleasant to use the simulated controllers, but if you just have to press one button, it will do the trick, no problem. And you can test it for like in a fraction of the time compared to the actual device. And now the actual kind of optimization part. Kind of the first things that should should be considered. The first thing that you should give to the player is some sort of a tutorial or some sort of clear hints to help the player. For example, on my project, there is at the start of the game there is a 20-second interval, where the player can see tooltips on the controller. There are lines drawn, box added, and it tells on the plate button that is a teleport. On the trigger, that's a use. On the grip button, that is grab. And when the player sees them, there's more probability for them to actually guess that what they are doing. But even though I have the tooltips, I have seen that the players have gone into the game. They are like, okay, here are the controls. Then they turn to the item they want to pick up. How do I pick it up? You just had a text box saying grab on the controller. That's why you kind of need to kind of punch the player in the face with the information, because especially in VR, people are so focused on all the other things than the controls. They just expect it to come naturally, but it's VR, it's technology, and it's not perfect, so it doesn't feel as natural as it could someday. So that's why we need to kind of help the expectations come a bit closer and give them clear hints on things. And what I put there is if controls don't work, make better hints or try something else. And this is especially coming from my point of view, because I stubbornly insisted on using the grip buttons on picking objects up. And as I told before, the grip button is the least noticed button in the whole Vive controller. But I still insisted on using it because I think that it's an intuitional way of picking things once you get to know of it. But now I'm thinking a bit backwards that maybe I just should use the trigger button because that's what everyone tries to use. It's the most intuitional button to actually try when you are first trying out VR. It's on your forefinger, and you are like, I want to grab this bottle up or whatever. Forefinger. Because nobody's going to try about actually doing some creepy motion. So it's something that I learned myself. I really like to use the grab button, but the grip button, but I may need to kind of find some other ways to use it in the future. Then I would suggest on giving every item that you are supposed to use or grab a bigger collider, because in the VR things may seem a bit closer to you than they actually are in the game, and that is part of the device's fault, but also it is sort of a perspection problem. So it is just better to use bigger colliders because you want them to be grabbing them on the first try, because nothing is more frustrating than kind of like, it's there, I think I'm grabbing it, but I'm not grabbing it. And that's going to be a horrible experience in the if that happens in the first minute or so. And partly relating to this is that I would really suggest on allowing the player to pick up objects from afar. For example, you would have a bottle here. I would be able to grab it here. There would be like 20 centimeters gap, but it is just good game design to allow that, because you don't want to go for that extra mile for that little bit of realism, because mainly the biggest problem is you pick out an item, oops, I accidentally dropped it, it's in the floor. If you do it realistically, you need to kneel down and grab it there, and that's going to break the flow of VR somewhat. And what some games do is that the player has some kind of Jedi powers, and they just point at it, pick it up, it comes to their hand. And that is actually quite intuitional, so I would greatly suggest on doing that. And yeah, and then maybe the greatest part, and what most people have actually most people at least think about it when they're developing VR games or playing them at some point, is the motion sickness. And This especially happened in the early Oculus Rift versions, where it wasn't that responsive and the resolution wasn't that great. It didn't feel that realistic to your brain, so it caused headaches, nausea, etc., etc. And nowadays, things that now that we know more about VR and we know how to tackle some of these problems, I can give you some of my recommendations. And the first of which is that when using a stick or directional buttons to control the player, the world moves in kind of an unnatural way, at least for the player's perspective. You are moving, but you are not actually moving your legs, and you are not feeling the movement. You are just gliding through the world, which is terribly unrealistic to your brain. And that, in many cases, causes nausea for people. And there actually are some ways to fix that a bit. The biggest problem is that usually in that kind of movement, the movement is kind of jerky. You are just transforming the player's position in the world, and you should kind of make it as smooth as possible. When you want something to be pleasant, you want it to be smooth. Even if the jerky movement isn't on the actual player, it can be an object that you are spinning around. But if it is spinning around in like 5 degrees at a time, it looks unnatural and it causes motion sickness on some people, even by seeing an object move in an unnatural way. So it is. I'd suggest on making objects move smoothly, rotate smoothly, move smoothly, because that is, in my mind, the #1 reason why people get motion sickness in Oculus Rift games. This doesn't happen that much in HTC Vive, because the player is using their own legs, their own arms. They feel the motion that they are doing inside the game, and that is what should be considered when making Vive games, that maintain that kind of control, feeling that you are the character that you are playing inside the game. And as long as that happens, most people won't feel at least that much motion sickness. Of course, there are always people who will be much more sensitive, and these things may not help them, and they maybe could have other kinds of way that it could be made better. But these are at least some that I have noticed. And one thing that should be avoided, in my mind, is that never make the player look at their feet if it's not necessary, because when player looks at their feet and they are not seeing them, the brain will automatically kind of snap that something is wrong. I'm not seeing my legs. I've actually seen people kind of lose their feet, become really unbalanced when they are looking at their feet and they are not seeing it, because if they are really sensitive to it, they may immediately lose the sense of ground, for example. The same kind of thing could happen also when jumping and falling in game, or, for example, when you are moving with only your hands in a game. They are quite the same in the end, because you are doing a movement that your body is telling you that you are not doing. If you jump by pressing a button, you will go up and down, which makes it. I'll wait for that. Yeah. So what I was explaining that when you are jumping by pressing a button, you are making an unnatural move, going up and down, which I've seen cause unbalancedness. And the same happens when falling. For example, if you have a climbing game where you actually accidentally let loose, if you are too much into the game and you are not remembering that you are actually using VR, you may actually go numb. You just lose the grip of your limbs and kind of fall to the ground as dead weight, and that may cause injuries. And sort of the same thing happens when climbing, but in a bit different way. For example, in Vive, you would have a wall climbing game. You would just grab yourself up. Your screen would move, but you will still feel that your legs are on the ground, and it causes a disconnect in your brain, and that can cause especially unbalancedness, but also motion sickness for some people, because that is also a mixed signals kind of state for the brain. And that's what I have to say about my own experiences. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Could someone bring a microphone here? Over there.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You talked about switching between developing and testing it out inside VR, like you just put up your headset or something like that. Yeah. Do any of the current tools support staying inside VR for things like modifying the colliders or even placing items in a scene? Because I guess if you, as you said, you have to make your colliders bigger, you would still need to test it inside VR, right? So is there any support for having like an edit mode inside VR?
I've actually thought about that, and that would be a really good feature. But as of now, I haven't found a way to do that. Because, for example, in Unity, the changes that are made inside the game while the game is running will be reverted when the game is stopped. So I think that is possible, but I don't know if there are tools for it yet. Any other questions? If not, I'll be ending my seminar here, and I'd like to ask you to come and visit us at our university's stand. It's right there on the hall if you start walking towards the main hall. It's on the right hand side, and you can try out the initial firefighting simulator I talked about earlier. Thank you.